In the summer of 2024, on a quiet limestone hill in southeastern Turkey, a team of archaeologists began digging into ground that no one had properly excavated before. What they found is now forcing historians to ask an uncomfortable question. What if the beginning of civilization we've been teaching for the last 15 years isn't the beginning at all? For nearly 2 decades, one name has dominated every conversation about the origins of human civilization: Göbekli Tepe. Discovered in the hills of Şanlıurfa province, Göbekli Tepe rewrote the textbooks the moment archaeologists confirmed its age. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars carved with foxes, scorpions, vultures, and boars, arranged in circular enclosures, built roughly 11,600 years ago. Nearly twice as old as Stonehenge, and older than pottery, older than the wheel, older than writing, older even than agriculture as we know it. It was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2018, and it earned a nickname that stuck: the 0 point of history. The place where, according to the story we've told for the last 20 years, human beings first gathered not to farm or hunt, but to build something monumental together. The place where religion, or ritual, or organized society, however you want to frame it, seems to switch on. But 0 point was always a strange thing to call it, because a 0 point implies nothing came before. And the deeper archaeologists dig into this particular stretch of Turkey, the more that assumption is falling apart. This is the story of Mendiktepe, a site that, if the current findings hold up, may turn out to be older than Göbekli Tepe itself. Let's start with where this is. Mendiktepe sits in the rural Payamlı neighborhood of the Eyüpiye district, in Şanlıurfa province, in what's often called Upper Mesopotamia, the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent. The region where humanity's shift from wandering hunter-gatherer bands to settled communities is believed to have first taken hold. It's not an isolated find. It sits within a network of sites that Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism has grouped together under a single research initiative called the Tash Tepeler project, which translates to Stone Hills. Göbekli Tepe is part of that network. So is its sister site, Karahan Tepe, discovered more recently and just as staggering, with its own forest of carved pillars and a chamber containing a striking arrangement of phallic-shaped stone pillars surrounding a carved human head. Mendiktepe is the newest addition to that same family of sites. And according to the archaeologists on the ground, it might be the oldest one yet. The person who first identified Mendiktepe is Fatma Şahin, who also directs excavations at another nearby Tash Tepeler site called Çakmaktepe. Formal excavation work at Mendiktepe began in 2024 under the leadership of Professor Douglas Baird of the University of Liverpool's Department of Archaeology. Baird isn't a newcomer to this region. He's spent years working across Tash Tepeler sites, and he's been outspoken about what makes this cluster of discoveries so significant. The dig is being carried out in cooperation with the Şanlıurfa Archaeology Museum, with support from the British Institute of Archaeology, as part of that broader Turkish government-backed Tash Tepeler initiative. So what have they actually found? As of the most recent reporting, excavators have uncovered a series of structures at Mendiktepe that vary noticeably in size, and that variation is exactly what has archaeologists intrigued. There appear to be smaller buildings, which the team believes may have been used for storage or food preparation. There are medium-sized structures, roughly 4 to 5 meters across, which could have functioned as houses or communal dwellings. And then there are larger structures, built with noticeably more careful, more meticulous stonework, which the excavation team believes may have served a ritual or ceremonial purpose. Professor Baird has described one of these larger structures in particular. Its construction quality, he says, strongly suggests it wasn't just a practical building. It was built to mean something. That combination is what makes Mendiktepe different from Göbekli Tepe in a very specific, very important way. Göbekli Tepe, as far as we can tell from decades of excavation, appears to have functioned primarily as a ritual center, a place people came to for ceremonial purposes rather than a place where they lived day to day. Mendiktepe looks different, with storage buildings, likely houses, and ritual structures all coexisting at the same site. It suggests something closer to a genuine settlement, a place of everyday life and spiritual practice intertwined, rather than a specialized ceremonial destination. If that interpretation holds, Mendiktepe isn't just another version of Göbekli Tepe. It may represent a different stage or a different kind of community entirely, within the same broader Neolithic world. There's also a difference in the architecture itself. And it's worth slowing down on this point because it's one of the most misunderstood parts of the story whenever it gets picked up online. Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe are both defined by their massive T-shaped pillars, towering stones, some over 5 meters tall, carved with animal reliefs arranged in deliberate circular formations. It's that T-shape and the artistry carved into it that makes those two sites so visually iconic. Mendiktepe does not have that. According to Professor Baird, the pillars at Mendiktepe are smaller, and they are not T-shaped. They're upright stones of a different form altogether. That's a meaningful detail because it means Mendiktepe isn't simply a smaller, older copy of Göbekli Tepe. It reflects what looks like a distinct architectural tradition, evidence that the people living across this region during the very early Neolithic weren't building from one single shared blueprint. There were variations. Different communities, working at different sites, seem to have been making different choices about how to build, how to organize their space, and possibly how to worship or gather. Now here's the part that actually explains the headline. The claim that this site could be 1,000 years older than Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe's earliest layers have been dated to roughly 9600 BCE, which puts the site at around 11,600 years old. That date has been fairly well established through years of stratigraphic work and radiocarbon analysis by the German Archaeological Institute team that has led excavations there since the 1990s. Mendiktepe's dating story is, by comparison, still being written. Based on the layers excavated so far, and comparisons with dating evidence from the nearby Çakmaktepe site, which shows strikingly similar early dates, researchers believe Mendiktepe may date to the very beginning of the Neolithic period. Douglas Baird himself has described it carefully. Mendiktepe is connected to the same network as Göbeklitepe and Karahantepe, but it might be slightly older. Other reporting on the dig has put a number on that, suggesting the structures could be at least 10,000 years old and potentially old enough to predate Göbekli Tepe by roughly 1,000 years. It's important to be precise about what that means and what it doesn't mean yet. This is not a finalized, peer-reviewed, absolute date locked in through multiple rounds of radiocarbon testing and published in an academic journal. This is a live excavation, less than 2 years old at the time of the most recent reporting, where the dating picture is still being assembled through comparative stratigraphy, meaning archaeologists are judging the age of the layers partly by comparing them to nearby, similarly dated sites like Çakmaktepe, and partly by the position and character of the archaeological layers themselves. Baird's own language throughout has been careful and conditional. Might be, may date back to, could predate. That's not evasiveness. That's what responsible archaeology sounds like in the middle of an active dig, before the full battery of scientific dating has been completed and published. If you see a headline stating flatly that Mendiktepe has been definitively proven older than Göbekli Tepe, treat that with some skepticism. The excavation team's own public statements are more measured than that. What isn't in question is the significance of finding this kind of site at all in this location at this stage of the Neolithic. The broader Tash Tepeler project has already reshaped how archaeologists think about the so-called Neolithic revolution, the transition of human societies from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled life, agriculture, and eventually the earliest cities. The old model was fairly linear. Humans settled down, started farming, and only once they had reliable food surpluses did they develop the social complexity needed for monumental architecture, organized religion, and specialized labor. Göbekli Tepe blew that model up when it was first properly studied, because it showed monumental, symbolically rich architecture built by hunter-gatherers, people who, as far as the evidence shows, had not yet domesticated plants or animals. No domesticated crops or livestock remains have been recovered from Göbekli Tepe's earliest layers, which means, according to that site alone, monumental building and organized ritual life came before farming, not after it. That's the exact opposite of the story archaeology told for most of the 20th century. Mendiktepe adds another layer to that puzzle rather than resolving it. If it does turn out to be as old as, or older than, Göbekli Tepe, and if its mixed residential and ritual character holds up under further excavation, it suggests the transition into settled life across this specific region wasn't a single event at a single site. It looks more like a broader regional phenomenon. Multiple communities at multiple hills, developing similar but distinct traditions of architecture and gathering, all within a fairly compressed window of time, right at the hinge point between the last hunter-gatherer societies and the first farming communities. Professor Baird has said as much directly. The goal of the Mendiktepe excavation isn't just to find an older date to put on a plaque. It's to understand how the Neolithic itself began and developed across this entire network of sites, Göbeklitepe, Karahantepe, Çakmaktepe, and now Mendiktepe, as pieces of one interconnected regional story rather than isolated one-off discoveries. It's also worth putting some numbers around why this region keeps producing finds like this in the first place. Southeastern Anatolia, specifically the area around Şanlıurfa, sits at the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf up through Mesopotamia and across to the eastern Mediterranean, long identified as one of the places on Earth where agriculture and settled human life first took root, alongside a handful of other independent centers around the world. Wild wheat and barley, the wild ancestors of some of humanity's first domesticated crops, grow naturally in this exact region. So the fact that this stretch of hills keeps yielding sites like Göbekli Tepe, Karahantepe, Çakmaktepe, and now Mendiktepe isn't really a coincidence. It's what you'd expect to find if this genuinely was one of the places where the earliest chapter of settled human life was written. The surprise isn't that these sites exist here. The surprise is how monumental, how symbolically complex, and how early some of them turn out to be. There's a temptation whenever a story like this breaks to reach for the most dramatic possible framing. Language about lost civilizations, hidden histories the mainstream refuses to accept, secrets that rewrite everything we thought we knew. It's worth being straightforward about that temptation and why it's not warranted here. What's happening at Mendiktepe is not a challenge to the basic timeline of human history. Nobody is suggesting an advanced lost civilization, and no credible archaeologist working on this project has made that claim. What's happening is normal, if unusually exciting, archaeological science. A new site is being excavated, its structures are being compared to known dates from other sites nearby, and its dating is being refined in real time as more of the site is uncovered. If Mendiktepe's dates get pinned down and it turns out to be a few centuries, or close to 1,000 years, older than Göbekli Tepe's earliest layers, that's a meaningful adjustment to the timeline of monumental architecture in this specific region. Not a demolition of everything historians have understood about the ancient world. Archaeology moves this way constantly. Dates get refined. Sites get discovered that push a known timeline back by decades, centuries, sometimes more. That's not a crisis for the field. That's the field working as intended. It's also worth remembering that this isn't even the first time a predates Göbekli Tepe claim has circulated. Back in the early 2010s, excavations at a site called Boncuklu Tarla in Turkey's Mardin province produced similar headlines. A Neolithic-era temple complex with monolithic stone structures, described at the time as potentially 11 to 300 years old, and framed in some coverage as a mini Göbekli Tepe that predated the famous site by roughly 1,000 years. That comparison shares almost exactly the same shape as the current Mendiktepe story. Same region, same rough claim, same 1,000 years older framing. That's not a reason to dismiss what's happening at Mendiktepe. If anything, it's a reminder that this specific corner of Turkey has been quietly producing candidate, oldest site in the world claims for well over a decade, and that each new discovery adds to a genuinely deep and complicated regional picture rather than replacing the last one. It also means it's worth holding claims like this a little loosely until the dating is confirmed through full radiocarbon analysis and formally published, which is exactly the caveat Professor Baird himself has been careful to include. So where does that leave things right now, as of the most recent reporting on the dig? Mendiktepe is an active excavation, still in its early stages, having launched in 2024 and continuing into 2025 and 2026 under Professor Douglas Baird's direction, working alongside the Şanlıurfa Archaeology Museum and the British Institute of Archaeology as part of Turkey's Tash Tepeler project. The site has already produced a mix of structures, small, medium, and large, hinting at a genuine settlement that combined domestic life with ritual or ceremonial activity, in contrast to Göbekli Tepe's more purely ceremonial character. Its pillars are smaller and architecturally distinct from the famous T-shaped stones at Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, pointing to a different building tradition within the same broader cultural network. And its dating, based on comparative evidence from the similarly aged nearby site of Çakmak Tepe, and on the character of its earliest excavated layers, suggests it may reach back to the very beginning of the Neolithic period, potentially predating Göbekli Tepe's roughly 11,600-year-old foundation layers by up to 1,000 years. That figure is a working estimate from an ongoing excavation, not yet a locked-in, peer-reviewed absolute date. What makes this genuinely worth paying attention to isn't a single dramatic headline number, it's the pattern. Every few years, the same stretch of hills in southeastern Turkey produces another site that pushes the known timeline of monumental construction, settled community life, or ritual architecture a little further back, or reveals another layer of complexity in how these early communities lived. Göbekli Tepe forced archaeologists to reconsider whether religion and ritual gathering preceded agriculture rather than following it. Karahan Tepe added its own strange, distinct symbolism to that picture. Çakmak. Tepe and Mendik. Tepe now suggests that even within this one small region, there wasn't a single uniform culture doing a single uniform thing. There were multiple communities, building in different styles, possibly organizing their lives differently, all navigating that same enormous transition from a life of following food to a life of staying in one place and building something permanent. That's the real story here. Not a single artifact or a single number that rewrites history overnight, but a slowly accumulating body of evidence, hill by hill, dig season by dig season, showing that the roots of settled human civilization in this part of the world go back further and were far more varied than anyone assumed even 20 years ago. Göbekli Tepe earned the nickname Zero Point of History because when it was discovered, nothing else came close to its age or its ambition. Mendiktepe is a reminder that the zero point keeps moving. Every time archaeologists think they've found the true beginning, the ground gives up something a little older, a little stranger, and a little harder to explain. Let's go a little deeper on Göbekli Tepe itself, because understanding exactly what it represents is the only way to understand why a site like Mendiktepe matters so much. The name translates from Turkish as belly hill or potbelly hill, a fairly plain description of a mound that, for most of the 20th century, nobody thought was anything special. It was first surveyed in 1963 by a joint team from Istanbul University and the University of Chicago, who noted some broken limestone slabs on the surface and assumed they were remnants of a medieval cemetery. The site was more or less written off. It took another 3 decades before German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt visited in 1994, recognized the slabs for what they actually were, and began formal excavations the following year. What Schmidt's team found over the following 2 decades reset the clock on organized human architecture. Circular and oval enclosures, ringed by T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, carved with foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures, and other animals, arranged with clear intentionality around central pairs of larger pillars. No pottery, no evidence of domesticated plants or animals in the earliest layers, which meant the people who quarried, carved, transported, and erected these enormous stones were still hunter-gatherers, not farmers when they did it. That single fact upended a model of human history that had stood largely unchallenged for generations. Prior to Göbekli Tepe, the standard assumption was that agriculture came first. Farming produced food surpluses. Food surpluses allowed populations to settle and grow. Settled, growing populations eventually developed the social organization, specialized labor, and spare time necessary to build monuments and support religious institutions. Temples were assumed to be a product of civilization, not a cause of it. Göbekli Tepe suggested the arrow might point the other way, at least in part, that the human drive to gather, build, and mark a shared sacred space might have come first, and that the enormous cooperative effort required to build something like Göbekli Tepe might actually have been one of the forces that pushed scattered hunter-gatherer groups toward the kind of settled, cooperative life that made agriculture possible in the first place. Schmidt himself, before his death in 2014, argued that Göbekli Tepe represented something like a gathering place on a hill for hunter-gatherer society, built by people coming together temporarily from a wide surrounding area, rather than a fixed resident population. Karahan Tepe entered the picture more recently, and it's a useful comparison point for understanding what makes Mendiktepe distinct. Located a relatively short distance from Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe is part of the same Tash Tepeler network and shares the same broad architectural language, T-shaped pillars, careful stone carving, circular gathering spaces, but it has its own unmistakable character. One chamber, sometimes referred to in press coverage as a kind of shrine, contains multiple phallic-shaped pillars projecting from stone benches around the walls, arranged around a carved human head emerging from the bedrock floor. The imagery is different from Göbekli Tepe's animal-heavy carvings, hinting that even within the same broad Tash Tepeler culture, different communities were expressing different symbolic and religious ideas. That's the pattern Mendiktepe now appears to be extending. Shared regional context, shared rough time period, but distinct local traditions. It's worth being clear about the scale of the broader Tash Tepeler project, because Mendiktepe isn't an isolated discovery bolted onto an existing story. It's the newest data point in a deliberate, ongoing government-backed research program. Tash Tepeler, meaning stone hills, is coordinated by Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism and encompasses a cluster of known sites scattered across the Şanlıurfa region, of which Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Çakmak Tepe, and Mendiktepe are among the most prominent. The project's stated goal is to move past treating each mound as an isolated curiosity, and instead map how this entire network of early Neolithic communities related to one another, what they shared, where they diverged, and how ideas, techniques, and traditions might have spread from hill to hill across the region during those critical centuries when human society was reorganizing itself from the ground up. Archaeology magazine, covering the project in 2024, quoted Professor Baird making exactly this point. That, taken together, the known Tash Tepeler sites suggest something genuinely revolutionary was happening across this landscape, and that the public buildings uncovered at these sites likely represent new kinds of social institutions, places that pulled together different families and different segments of a community for a shared purpose, evidence for which simply doesn't survive anywhere else in the archaeological record from this period. That's really the frame to hold on to here. It's tempting to reduce a story like this to a single competitive number. Is Mendiktepe older than Göbekli Tepe? Yes or no? By how many years? Because that's the version of the story that fits neatly into a headline. But the archaeologists actually doing the digging are not framing it as a competition. They're framing it as a regional puzzle, where each new site adds another piece to a picture of how, roughly 12,000 years ago, Communities across a fairly compact stretch of Upper Mesopotamia, independently and semi-independently, began building structures meant to last, meant to gather people, and meant to mean something beyond simple shelter. Right at the exact moment, those same communities were beginning to experiment with the earliest stages of plant cultivation that would eventually become full agriculture. That transition, from mobile foraging to permanent settlement to farming, is precisely what Professor Baird has said his team is trying to pin down at Mendiktepe specifically. It's not just about finding an older date, it's about catching a community in the act of that transition, gathering evidence of early plant use, examining how living spaces and ritual spaces were organized side by side, and comparing all of it against what's known from Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and Çakmaktepe to build a fuller picture of how this shift actually unfolded on the ground, hill by hill, rather than as a single clean event. There's also a practical, on-site texture to this kind of work that's worth mentioning, because it grounds the story in something more real than a headline. Excavating a site like Mendiktepe is slow, careful, physically demanding work, carried out through Şanlıurfa's brutal summer heat, sifting through more than 12,000 years of accumulated layers of soil, ash, collapsed stone, and debris. The tools of the earliest people who lived here were hand-chiseled flint implements, the kind of everyday objects that turn up constantly in the process of exposing the larger architecture. Every wall, every post hole, every scatter of worked stone has to be recorded in place before it can be removed, because the exact position of an object relative to the layers around it is often what allows archaeologists to estimate a date before laboratory testing is even possible. That's the process currently unfolding at Mendiktepe, painstaking, incremental, and still very much in progress, season by season, as the team works to expose more of the site and refine exactly how old it really is. So if you strip away the sensational headline version of this story, the kind that turns might be slightly older into definitively older, or turns a careful, ongoing excavation into a finished discovery, what's left is still genuinely remarkable. A previously unexcavated site in the same tight cluster of hills that already gave the world Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe has produced early evidence of a settlement combining domestic structures with what looks like ritual architecture, built in a style distinct from its more famous neighbors, potentially dating to the very start of the Neolithic period. Old enough that, if the current estimates hold up under further testing, it could turn out to predate Göbekli Tepe's earliest known layers by something in the range of 1,000 years. That's not a rewriting of everything we know about human history. It's the continuation of a story that this exact region has been quietly telling archaeologists for the better part of 3 decades, that the roots of settled human life, organized religion, and monumental architecture reach back further and grew in more varied and unexpected forms than almost anyone assumed before Klaus Schmidt first climbed that unremarkable-looking hill in 1994. The excavation at Mendiktepe is ongoing. Full dating results, further structural analysis, and formal academic publication are still to come, and those results will ultimately determine exactly how this site fits into the timeline alongside Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and Çakmaktepe. But even at this early stage, with the caveats still firmly in place, one thing is already clear. The story of how and where human beings first began building permanent, symbolically meaningful structures together is nowhere near finished being told. Somewhere under the soil of southeastern Turkey, there may be an even older hill still waiting to be found.